What if the earliest experiments in genetics were not conducted in laboratories, but on human beings enslaved on American soil? What if the ledgers of plantations, written in ink, sealed in chests, hidden from sight, were in truth the first manuals of hereditary science? Welcome to Gothic Ledger. Tonight, we open a case file almost erased from history, one that reveals how slavery and science collided in the most unsettling of ways. Before eugenics had a name, before Mendel wrote of peas, America's plantations had already begun a darker project, the forced breeding of human beings, catalogued with chilling precision and preserved in ledgers that were never meant to be read aloud again. But here, in the quiet halls of ruined estates and sealed university vaults, fragments remain, records of men and women paired against their will, children sold as bloodlines, doctors who became experimenters, and archives that whisper of secrets still locked away. As we follow these fragments, from the crumbling cellars of Virginia to the restricted archives of modern universities, we will confront the uncomfortable continuity. How the arithmetic of slavery became the language of heredity, how the plantation became the blueprint for eugenics, and how DNA itself still carries echoes of what was once done in silence. Before we begin, take a moment to tell us where you are watching from, and what time it is where you are. Your comments form a kind of ledger of their own, a record of how far these stories travel. And if you find value in uncovering truths long buried, like and subscribe, so you never miss the next descent into history's shadows. Because tonight we open the box they tried to burn, and inside the experiment is still waiting. The ruins of a Virginia plantation sit silent beneath creeping ivy and fallen timbers. Time has swallowed most of its bones, leaving only scorched brick and the memory of industry long extinguished. Yet in the cellar, where the air remains cool and heavy, a sealed chest was found. The wood, warped and brittle, cracked open under careful hands, releasing a smell of mildew and dust, an odor not unlike damp earth disturbed after too many years of silence. Inside, there were no coins, no silver, no heirlooms. Instead, the box contained ledgers. The ink had browned, the paper fragile enough to crumble with touch. At first glance, they resembled crop accounts or inventories of livestock. But as the pages unfolded, it became clear these records told another story. Names of the enslaved were listed in rows, followed by numbers, notations, and calculations. Pairings were charted, offspring recorded, traits annotated with the precision of a scientist at work. Beside one name, strong arms, fertile. Beside another, docile temperament. Still another bore the mark, poor health, discard. This was not the language of harvest. It was the language of experiment. Each page read less like a plantation ledger and more like a genetic chart, decades before the word genetics was ever coined. Crosses and arrows traced bloodlines. Columns documented how certain unions yielded children of desirable build or unsatisfactory weakness. The handwriting belonged not only to overseers but to physicians. Their notes were clinical, detached, recording reproductive outcomes with the same detachment they might apply to animal breeding. The plantation itself had ceased to be a place of agriculture. It had become a laboratory. Enslaved men and women were not counted as laborers but as subjects, their value tied not to what they could produce in the fields, but to the children they might be forced to bear. One volume carried the title Register of Issue, its opening lines meticulously numbered. Each entry was dated, paired, and followed by calculations of expected profit years into the future. The children themselves were reduced to projections, their lives anticipated as assets long before their first cries filled the air. What remains most disturbing is not the mere existence of these ledgers, but the deliberate secrecy surrounding them. Tucked into a sealed chest, Buried beneath the rot of the cellar, they were never meant to surface. These books were not designed for display or legal accounting. They were private records, perhaps evidence, perhaps trophies, of experiments conducted in silence. The chest stands as a reminder. Beneath the architecture of slavery lay an unspoken obsession with heredity. This was not only a system of profit, but also a system of manipulation, one that used the human body as material for calculation. The plantation became the cradle of a grim science. And so the first chapter opens not with crops or commerce, but with a chest of ledgers waiting in the dark. Proof that even before eugenics was named, its experiments had already begun. Not all plantations were built to harvest cotton, tobacco, or rice. Some existed for a different purpose entirely: multiplication. Across Virginia, Maryland, and the Carolinas, isolated estates operated as what came to be known as breeding farms. Their soil bore crops, yes, but the true harvest was human. Here, enslaved men and women were reduced to their most basic biological functions. They were classified not as workers, but as stock, their value calculated in terms of reproductive capacity. Young women were catalogued for fertility, strong men for the likelihood of transmitting strength. The ledger entries were stark: prime breeder, good for issue, unsuitable for further pairing. It was language identical to livestock manuals of the same period. Financial records reveal that these plantations produced more profit from births than from fields. Children were raised not as members of families, but as commodities prepared for sale. The average woman was expected to bear many children, each one an asset increasing the ledger's balance. The system stripped reproduction of intimacy, turning it into a forced economy of bloodlines. Overseers tracked cycles and pairings with the precision of animal husbandry. Some accounts describe men moved from farm to farm, chosen for stature or endurance, their lives reduced to the role of stud. Others tell of women paired against their will, their pregnancies monitored as though they were experiments in flesh. The cruelty was not only physical, but systematic, a design to refine and replicate certain traits across generations. Plantations like these blurred the line between labor camp and laboratory. A field hand might be reassigned overnight to breeding duty. His or her identity shifted from worker to progenitor. Families were splintered, reconfigured, reassembled, all under the guise of economic necessity. The very notion of kins, hip, was dismantled, replaced by cold arithmetic. Records show that these farms supplied the broader market of the South. Newborns were sold into states where the international slave trade had been outlawed, their bodies feeding an insatiable demand. The breeding farm ensured supply, regardless of morality, legality, or humanity. It was a machine running on forced intimacy, generating profit in the form of children. The archival silence surrounding these farms is telling. Few photographs survive, and many plantation journals avoid naming the practice outright. Yet fragments emerge, in sale records, medical notes, and testimonies whispered by descendants. They expose a truth that the nation once tried to bury. Some plantations existed not to grow crops, but to manufacture people. And so the breeding farm must be understood not as rumor or metaphor, but as reality, an institution where industrial cruelty found its most efficient form. Here, bodies became currency, blood became inventory, and life itself became the most profitable crop. What if such a place once stood in your own county, hidden beneath the soil you walk on today? Do you know of family stories, rumors, or oral histories that might connect to this shadowed chapter of America's past? Share them in the comments below. The plantation ledger was never just a list of names. In its margins and columns lay an obsession with detail, an early attempt to capture heredity before the science of genetics had a name. On brittle pages, enslaved families became data points. Beside each entry there were notations: tall, strong back, good lungs, or else weak, poorly built. likely to fail. It was a chilling kind of order, one that reduced entire lineages to columns of traits. A boy of 10 might be marked for his promise of height. A girl, barely past childhood, catalogued for her broad hips and likely fertility. Others were deemed undesirable, slow of mind, melancholic, stunted. The handwriting was steady, clinical, betraying no sense of the violence it inscribed. The patterns on these pages resemble what later would be called pedigree charts. Lines and arrows tracked parents and offspring. Traits appeared, disappeared, re-emerged across generations. Long before Gregor Mendel began recording the heights of pea plants in a monastery garden, plantation owners were already constructing their own hereditary studies in human flesh. Each notation was not idle observation, but calculation. Children were projected forward like sums in a ledger, their future bodies imagined before they had even grown. A woman labelled fertile carried with her the expectation of multiple profitable births. A man noted for strength of limb was paired strategically, his children expected to replicate his build. Families were torn apart not by chance but by arithmetic, by the cold hand of someone convinced they could direct inheritance like a crop. These records also betray a preoccupation with temperament. Obedient, pliant, docile were words as carefully logged as strong, tall, healthy. The ideal enslaved body was not only resilient but compliant. Those who resisted or displayed a sullen temperament were marked as problematic stock, their bloodlines carefully managed or extinguished. Side by side with the human entries, comparisons to livestock were not uncommon. Some ledgers listed horses, cattle, and people within the same books, each recorded for strength, yield, and breeding potential. The categories blurred until humanity itself was reduced to a variation of husbandry. The silence of these records is perhaps the most violent element. No cries, no refusals, no grief survives in the handwriting. The notations are skeletal: trait, pairing, outcome. The absence of voice is itself evidence, proof of a system designed to erase individuality in pursuit of calculation. And yet, through these columns, a pattern emerges. This was more than record-keeping. It was an early science, distorted, unethical, and hidden beneath the language of commerce. Plantation owners were not only masters of land, but experimenters of heredity, using their ledgers as laboratories, testing the boundaries of human control over bloodlines. To hold these pages today is to confront a ledger of human lives reduced to currency. A book that reads less like an account of harvest and more like the prototype of modern genetics, drawn not in plants or animals, but in people. The plantation doctor was not merely a healer. In the dim rooms where enslaved women labored, in the notes written by lamplight after a day's work, he became something else, an experimenter. His journals reveal a role more insidious than caretaker. He was the overseer of reproduction, the recorder of hereditary outcomes, the silent hand guiding forced experiments. Medical training in the 19th century was crude, yet plantations offered physicians something hospitals could not, an unending supply of subjects. Here, procedures could be attempted without consent. Births were attended not only for survival but for study. Infants were weighed, measured, noted for strength or weakness. Stillbirths were dissected, their bodies examined for signs of defect. Every detail was inscribed, as if each life and death added to a growing textbook. Women bore the brunt of this scrutiny. Some journals describe crude gynecological procedures, experimental surgeries carried out in kitchens or barns under the guise of treatment. Others reveal forced sterilizations, justified as measures against unproductive bloodlines. The language of care blurred seamlessly into the language of control. Fertility was monitored like a crop cycle, and physicians placed themselves as gatekeepers of hereditary improvement. What emerges from these writings is not compassion but calculation. One entry might note, mother prone to melancholy, offspring weak, observe next generation. Another, exceptional strength of arms, passed to 2 sons, recommend pairing with fertile line. The tone was detached, as though describing plants or livestock, not human beings with lives and voices of their own. The cruelty lay not only in the procedures themselves, but in the erasure of humanity through clinical language. Pain was absent from the notes, resistance went unmentioned. All that remained were the results, stripped of the suffering required to obtain them. These records transformed violence into data. The doctors who filled these pages believed themselves men of science. They borrowed the language of medicine, spoke of fitness and degeneration, and cloaked their exploitation in terms of study. Yet their experiments were neither neutral nor objective. They were deeply entangled in the economics of slavery. Every observation of hereditary illness, every attempt at surgical intervention served the plantation's financial interests. Lives were prolonged or curtailed, not for care, but for profit. Some of these findings even reached medical journals of the era. Case studies described rare conditions or anatomical anomalies in enslaved people, presented as contributions to science. Nowhere did they mention the coercion behind the data, the lack of consent, the violence of acquisition. Knowledge was extracted from suffering, then polished into scholarship. In these pages we see the blurred beginnings of genetics disguised as medicine. Doctors spoke of hereditary weakness and familial traits with a clinical eye, decades before modern science would adopt the same language. Their role was not accidental. They were the first archivists of a grim biology, embedding the plantation system into the roots of medical history. The plantation doctor, then, was never only a healer. He was a recorder, a manipulator, and at times an executioner. His hand wrote the first genetic charts in human blood. In Virginia's Goochland County, a particular plantation became known for something darker than cotton or tobacco. It was remembered not for fields tilled, but for families dismantled. Locals would later whisper of a place where the crop was not harvest, but bloodline. This was the Goochland breeding farm. Survivor accounts, rare, fragmented, and filtered through descendants, describe a system designed with ruthless efficiency. Men and women were paired under instruction, their unions chosen not by affection, but by calculation. Children were born into the world already marked, already destined for sale. In ledgers, their names appeared alongside notations: healthy, robust, likely breeder. Infants, not yet able to walk, were described as future assets. Testimony recalls mothers separated from their children as soon as they were weaned. Some infants were taken hundreds of miles away, sold into states where importation had been banned. Their origins erased, their names replaced, their bodies transformed into commodities. Survivors spoke of the silence that followed, of mothers who never again saw the children torn from their arms. Records from Goochland echo the language of livestock breeding. Family lines were tracked over decades, noting which unions produced children of strength, which yielded illness, which resulted in unproductive stock. The system was generational, industrial, its purpose not merely profit in the moment, but an experiment in hereditary design. One account tells of a man used as a stud, sent from one household to another to father children he would never know. His role was reduced to reproduction, his identity fractured across dozens of families that carried his blood but not his presence. Others speak of women kept apart from their kin, selected for their lineage of fertility, bearing children in a cycle without end. The cruelty of Goochland lay not only in the physical act of forced breeding, but in its systemic nature. It was not chaos but control, not rumor but record. The ledgers that survive bear dates, numbers, and cold precision. They reveal a plantation that functioned less like a farm and more like a factory of human lives. Goochland is not an isolated story. It stands as a symbol of what breeding farms across the South represented. Laboratories of human reproduction, hidden beneath the language of agriculture. But here, in this place, the evidence is sharper, the testimonies clearer, the cruelty undeniable. The question remains, why were these records preserved? Were they intended as proof of profit, or as trophies of mastery? And why did some survive when so many were destroyed? Their very survival suggests a deeper unease that what was written might one day be read. What if such records were discovered in your own county courthouse? Would you demand their release to the public, or would you fear the truths they contained? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The most disturbing entries in plantation ledgers are not those that record sales or births, but those that trace deliberate unions across bloodlines. Families once formed by survival and resilience were dismantled, then reassembled according to plan. A brother might be sent away, a sister retained. Years later, they were brought together again, not as kin, but as subjects in a calculated experiment. In these records, we see the logic of livestock breeding applied to human beings. Traits were selected, replicated, and reinforced through forced incest. Half-siblings were paired to preserve strength of build. Cousins were united to maintain fertility. Children born of these unions were observed, logged, and sometimes paired again within the same bloodline. Generations folded back upon themselves, engineered by overseers who believed heredity could be directed like the traits of cattle or horses. The cruelty was not only in the act, but in the systematic stripping of identity. Kinship ties meant nothing when pitted against the arithmetic of inheritance. A child might be raised not as son or daughter, but as future pairing material, their path determined before adolescence. By adulthood, their role was already written, to reproduce under instruction, not by choice. Ledger entries reveal chilling clarity. Pair with half-sister, strong line. Recombine with cousin, fertility observed. Child weak, line should be broken. Such phrases speak of a project that spanned decades, with the enslaved body treated as raw material for hereditary engineering. The goal was consistency. Plantation owners sought to fix traits the way breeders sought to fix the qualities of a prized horse: endurance, stature, docility. The enslaved became subjects in a proto-science of genetics, though cloaked in the brutal language of commerce. It was not enough to profit from labor. The very essence of litige fee was manipulated for refinement. Accounts from survivors, though sparse, recall the psychological devastation. Children grew into adulthood without clear lines of kinship, confused by families split and reconfigured. Some spoke of being warned never to call a brother by his name, never to speak of lineage, for fear of disrupting the owner's plan. The silence surrounding family identity became a weapon as cruel as the breeding itself. Comparisons to animal breeding are not accidental. Plantation manuals often kept cattle and human pairings side by side, the logic identical. Strength multiplied through close kin, bloodlines tightened for predictable outcome. Yet where livestock breeding carried risk of deformity or weakness, plantation owners treated enslaved children with defects not as warnings, but as expendable failures in an ongoing experiment. The plantation, in this form, was no longer simply an economic machine. It was a closed system of biological manipulation. Within its walls, time itself became a tool. Generations stacked atop one another in a relentless pursuit of engineered heredity. What end did they seek? Was it profit alone, or something darker? A desire to master bloodlines, to play creator with human flesh? The records do not answer, but the evidence is clear. Families were dismantled, reshaped, and forced into incestuous cycles. The plantation had become not only a prison, but a laboratory of lineage. The Civil War ended, and with it the formal structure of slavery. Plantations crumbled, ledgers were hidden, and the language of breeding was forced into silence. But the logic that shaped those experiments did not vanish. It migrated, finding new shelter in the brick walls of asylums. Across the late 19th century, institutions swelled with those labeled unfit, degenerate, or defective. Many were descendants of families once catalogued in plantation records. Freed from bondage but still bound by stigma, they were confined once more, this time in medical cells rather than plantation cabins. The asylum became the plantation reborn in another form. Where overseers once chose pairings, doctors now chose sterilizations. Where ledgers once tracked traits, admission records now documented hereditary defect. The words changed, but the cruelty remained. A person was no longer called stock, but unfit. They were no longer bred, but instead prevented from breeding. Eugenics offered the intellectual bridge. It dressed the plantation's practices in the language of science, framing them as a matter of public health rather than profit. Traits once marked as docile or fertile were now categorized as fit. Traits once deemed weak or sullen became grounds for confinement. The continuum is unmistakable. The plantation's arithmetic of heredity became the asylum's arithmetic of defect. Records from institutions echo plantation ledgers with chilling precision. Doctors tracked family lines of patients, noting siblings, parents, and children afflicted by feeble-mindedness, madness, or melancholia. They created charts, not unlike the old breeding diagrams, attempting to trace undesirable traits through generations. The asylum became a living archive of heredity, its patients transformed into proof of theories that echoed slavery's logic. The atmosphere of these irons was suffocating. Iron bars replaced overseers, medical jargon replaced ledgers, but the same cold detachment governed both spaces. Families were again dismantled, their members scattered into state facilities. Entire bloodlines became marked, not for profit this time, but for elimination. By the early 20th century, eugenics gained formal power. Laws were written that justified forced sterilization, borrowing quietly from the plantation's earlier experiments. The language of heredity persisted, only cloaked in clinical respectability. The cruelty was now bureaucratic, stamped with state seals and endorsed by university studies. One family, marked in asylum records as notorious degenerates, could trace its lineage back to names found in a plantation breeding register. The continuity is undeniable. Those once bred under compulsion were now confined under law, their bloodlines scrutinized under a new banner. The plantation's experiment had become the asylum's mandate. The transition from chains to cells was not a rupture, but an evolution. The language shifted, the institutions changed, but the underlying belief that certain lives could be managed, curtailed, or erased for the sake of order remained intact. The plantation's arithmetic lived on in medical charts, asylum case files, and sterilization laws. Emancipation did not end the experiment. It merely moved it indoors, behind stone walls and the authority of science. Among the scattered fragments of plantation ledgers and asylum registers, certain names reappear. They surface across decades, first in ink scrawled by overseers, later in the neat columns of institutional files. One such family, known here as the Hendersons, illustrates how heredity itself became a sentence. The earliest traces appear in a breeding register from the 1830s. The entries are stark. Henderson girl, fertile, strong hips, paired with Henderson male, sturdy frame. The pairing was deliberate, arranged to reinforce strength. The child produced from this union is noted simply as promising. From there, the name threads its way through a series of records. By the 1840s, a second generation of Henderson children is logged, some praised for endurance, others marked with words like weak or unreliable. With emancipation, the family's circumstances shifted, but their names did not vanish from official record. Instead, they migrated into another system. By the late 19th century, asylum admission files begin to list Hendersons among their patients. One file describes a young woman, the granddaughter of those first documented pairings, committed for hysteria and weakness of mind. Her notes include reference to her family history, a phrase that by then had become shorthand for hereditary suspicion. The pattern deepens with each generation. A Henderson son, confined in 1902, is described as melancholic, unfit for labor. His admission papers contain not only his own symptoms but a chart of his relatives, as if the asylum itself had taken up the plantation's old project of tracing heredity. In margins, officials scribbled comments, "Degenerate stock, line not worth continuing." The asylum's gaze reached backward as much as forward. Just as plantation owners once calculated potential offspring, doctors now projected the family line into the future, except the AI had shifted. Where the plantation sought multiplication, the asylum sought eradication. Henderson blood was no longer profitable. It was considered dangerous. The solution was not pairing, but confinement, sterilization, and silence. This family narrative, drawn from multiple fragments, is less a story of individuals than of systemic continuity. The Hendersons serve as a composite of many such families, whose names carried weight, not by choice, but by record. They were born into histories already written, their futures shaped by ledgers and files that treated bloodlines as evidence. The inevitability is dreadful. Plantation breeding notes identified traits to be replicated. Asylum files identified traits to be extinguished. Both systems leaned on the same logic, heredity as destiny, blood as proof. For the Hendersons, emancipation offered no escape, only a transfer from one form of captivity to another. The case reminds us that archives do not merely record history, they perpetuate it. To trace the Hendersons across ledgers and admission books is to see a family stalked by ink, bound by words, their very surname transformed into a mark of stigma. Here, in the Henderson file, the plantation's arithmetic of life and the asylum's arithmetic of defect meet. And the human cost is measured not in crops or currency, but in generations lost to a system that refused to let them exist freely. When whispers of investigation began, the ledgers started to vanish. Plantation owners who once kept meticulous records of births, pairings, and traits suddenly grew cautious. Boxes of documents were removed from attics, papers consigned to flames, and family archives stripped of their darkest volumes. What remained was ash and silence. Some plantations left little trace at all. Visitors searching for financial accounts found gaps where years of records should have been. Farmers who once prided themselves on orderly books now presented ledgers with missing pages, the torn edges betraying what had been removed. In other cases, entire volumes disappeared, their absence as telling as any presence. Yet destruction was rarely complete. Fragments survived in unexpected places. Doctors kept personal journals that outlived the plantations they served. Letters between owners contained passing references to stock and issue. Medical notes preserved in institutional archives mentioned procedures on enslaved women without ever naming them. These scraps, scattered across private collections and university libraries, form the mosaic that reveals the larger truth. The deliberate erasure is its own evidence. Why burn papers if they were merely business? Why seal them in family vaults if they held no shame? The very act of suppression speaks to awareness that these records were never meant to withstand scrutiny. The plantation owner's ledger, once a tool of commerce, became a liability when exposed to the gaze of history. In some courthouses, officials recorded suspicious gaps. Entire family estates submitted probate inventories with no mention of breeding registers, though oral testimony insisted they once existed. A handful of cases described neighbors seeing smoke rising as old records were consigned to fire. The owners claimed they were clearing space. The reality was an attempt to obliterate evidence. Still, fragments are stubborn things. A single page rescued from an attic can unravel decades of silence. A letter tucked between unrelated papers can reveal calculations of profit from children not yet born. Each surviving piece carries the weight of absence, the suggestion that for every scrap we hold, entire volumes once stood beside it. Modern historians confront an archive that is as much about what is missing as what remains. The gaps themselves become data, the blank spaces speaking to suppression. We reconstruct patterns not from full ledgers, but from traces, a doctor's marginal note, a child's bill of sale, a torn ledger page where a family line was once inscribed. This is the archaeology of absence. To study destroyed archives is to sift through ashes, to listen to the silence left behind, to recognize that erasure was itself an act of control. The breeding farms sought not only to engineer bodies, but to engineer memory, leaving behind a curated history scrubbed of its most damning details. Yet silence cannot erase the truth entirely. Enough fragments endure to reveal the pattern, a system hidden, then denied, yet never fully erased. In the gaps between ash and ink, the shadow of the breeding experiment remains. The ledgers of plantations spoke plainly of breeding. Men and women were paired, children were stock, and futures were projected. It was the language of livestock, unvarnished in its cruelty. But after emancipation, as the plantation system collapsed, the terminology itself began to shift. What once was spoken openly became veiled in new words, words drawn from science, medicine, and policy. Breeding became heredity. The strength of stock became fitness. The weakness of issue was renamed degeneracy. The shift was subtle, but profound. It cloaked brutality in clinical detachment, transforming acts of violence into phrases that suggested objectivity. To speak of breeding was to reveal cruelty. To speak of heredity was to suggest study. Early eugenics texts of the late 19th and early 20th centuries echo the plantation ledgers with striking familiarity. Where overseers once noted docile, fit for labor, eugenicists later wrote feeble-minded, suitable for institutionalization. Where plantation doctors described exceptional fertility, eugenicists praised prolific hereditary lines. The language had evolved, but the logic remained identical. This vocabulary shift did more than sanitize history. It embedded plantation logic into the foundations of modern science. By rephrasing forced pairings as experiments in heredity and catalogued children as data, the atrocities of slavery were repackaged into research. What began in the cotton fields now appeared in textbooks, academic lectures, and government reports. The plantation's arithmetic of human life became the laboratory's arithmetic of genetic fitness. The camouflage of words allowed these ideas to persist and spread. Legislators could speak of public health rather than control. Doctors could publish observations of heredity rather than admissions of cruelty. Universities could teach eugenics as respectable science without acknowledging that its roots lay in the forced reproduction of enslaved people. Words became a shield, protecting the practice of manipulation from moral scrutiny. The continuity is undeniable. Plantation owners sought productive stock. Eugenicists sought fit citizens. Both reduced human life to inherited traits, measurable and manageable. Both imagined a future shaped by control of bloodlines. The language evolved, but the vision did not. To study these shifts is to see how history disguises itself. Cruelty rarely vanishes, it changes costume, and here, it dressed itself in the robes of science. By the time the 20th century dawned, what once was plantation arithmetic had become state policy. Sterilization laws, asylum commitments, immigration restrictions, all were justified by terms that seemed neutral but carried the weight of slavery's logic. Do you see how words can erase cruelty or disguise it as science? When breeding becomes heredity, when stock becomes fitness, what is lost in translation and what is concealed? Share your thoughts below. The plantation ledgers, then, are not merely relics of the past. They are the first draft of a vocabulary that still shapes how we speak of genetics today. The medical journals of the 19th century are filled with case studies, observations, and surgical reports. At first glance, they read as the record of a profession striving towards science. But between the lines lies another story, one in which enslaved bodies were the silent subjects of experiments that blurred the line between doctor and breeder. Gynecological surgeries appear often in these accounts. Physicians documented procedures carried out on enslaved women, describing in detail the manipulation of reproductive organs, the treatment of infertility, and the correction of complications in childbirth. Yet the journals are silent on the matter of consent. The women are named only by first name, if at all, and spoken of as cases rather than as lives. Their pain is absent, their protest erased. What remains is the cold technical language of procedure. Anatomical studies extended beyond the living. Stillbirths, miscarried fetuses, and children who died in infancy were dissected, their bodies opened in search of clues about heredity and disease. Reports describe cranial measurements, examinations of bone structure, and notes on anomalies. The clinical detachment of these writings masks the reality. Children reduced to specimens, their humanity stripped away in pursuit of knowledge. Some journals reveal experiments that border on breeding in name as well as function. One physician describes observing multiple births across generations of the same family, noting fertility rates and survival outcomes as though tallying a controlled experiment. Another speaks of the degenerative line of a woman whose children were prone to illness, recommending that the family be watched and recorded. These comments echo the logic of the plantation ledger, merely transposed into medical phrasing. The absence of consent is not oversight, it is evidence of the hierarchy that allowed such experiments to exist. Enslaved men and women were considered available for medical use, their bodies treated as resources for study. Doctors justified their actions by arguing that procedures improved knowledge for all, yet the burden of risk, pain, and death fell entirely upon those who had no choice. The findings, however, were not confined to private plantation notes. They entered the canon of medical literature. Articles published in respected journals spread these observations across the country, giving them legitimacy. Future doctors studied them, absorbed them, and passed them forward. In this way, the exploitation of enslaved people became woven into the very foundations of American medicine. These writings are early roots of medical racism. By treating the enslaved body as an experimental object, physicians created a precedent in which black patients would be seen as less than fully human in clinical settings. The belief that suffering was tolerable, that lives were expendable, did not vanish with slavery. It lingered, shaping practices long after emancipation. To read these journals today is to encounter the surgical coldness of history. Detached words describe acts that were anything but neutral. They are dissections of humanity disguised as science, reminders that progress was not born from discovery alone, but from the silent suffering of those who could not refuse. The slave market was not only a site of labor exchange, it was a marketplace for bloodlines. Amid the crowded squares of Richmond, Charleston, and New Orleans, certain individuals fetched higher prices not for their immediate work, but for the children they might produce. Auction records speak plainly of a class of enslaved men and women sold as breeding stock. The advertisements singled them out. Men were praised for stature, endurance, or proven fertility. They were marketed as studs, capable of fathering many children, their value not in the labor of their own bodies, but in the bodies of the generations they could generate. Women, meanwhile, were listed by age, health, and reproductive history. A woman who had borne several children already could be sold at a premium, her fertility regarded as tested and reliable. The cruelty of this market was systematic. Families were dismantled in order to maximize financial return. A man might be separated from his wife and sold as a breeder elsewhere. A woman with children might be taken from them, her own body valued more than the bond she carried. Auction notes describe the separation of infants from mothers, their cries dismissed as the incidental cost of commerce. Records show lineage treated as financial asset. Catalogues of sale sometimes listed not only the individual but their offspring, projecting the value of future generations into the bidding. A man of exceptional strength might be noted for sons already in labor. His potential expanded into a promise of multiplied profit. A fertile woman might be sold with her children at her side, all bundled into one transaction, a living inheritance reduced to numbers on a page. Auctioneers adopted the language of livestock. Phrases like sound, proven, prime stock echo those used in animal markets. The reduction of human life to this terminology reveals the brutal commodification at work. What had been engineered on the plantation was now monetized in public view, an industry that treated heredity itself as a saleable commodity. Witness accounts describe the unsettling efficiency of these sales. Buyers moved among lines of men and women, examining teeth, probing muscle, questioning health. For those sold as breeders, the scrutiny was often harsher, invasive, justified by their supposed future yield. Onlookers spoke of the transactional coldness, children priced not as lives but as units of potential. The system of sale reinforced the logic of plantation breeding. Pairings were not random, they were directed by the market. A stud purchased in Richmond might be sent to a farm in Mississippi, a fertile woman to Alabama, each chosen for qualities that buyers hoped to propagate. Bloodlines crossed states not through freedom, but through commerce. This market of bloodlines reveals the fullest expression of commodification, human inheritance, bought and sold like property. The ledgers of these sales are case studies in cruelty, their lists echoing with the silence of broken families. Here, reproduction itself became currency, and blood became the most valuable commodity of all. The past does not always remain in archives. Sometimes it lingers in the body itself. Modern genetics, armed with sequencing tools and population studies, has uncovered patterns within African American ancestry that trace directly back to the breeding practices of plantations. These discoveries are not metaphors. They are measurable imprints written in DNA. Population studies reveal anomalies. Skewed ratios of European Y chromosomes compared to African mitochondrial lines, reflecting generations of coercive pairings between white men and enslaved women. But beyond the broad strokes of ancestry, deeper markers appear, genetic traits that seem to mirror the very qualities once noted in plantation ledgers. Height, endurance, fertility, and certain hereditary illnesses reveal clusters shaped not by choice, but by systematic manipulation. Where ledgers once recorded a woman as fertile, modern studies note unusually high reproductive lineage traced back to single enslaved mothers. Where a man was catalogued as exceptional strength, DNA now reveals concentrated genetic traits in communities descended from those unions. Even the marks of hereditary weakness, illnesses observed by plantation doctors, emerge in the genomes of descendants centuries later. The evidence is clinical, detached, and yet it hums with unease. It confirms what the ledgers suggested, that slavery was not only an economic system, but an early form of genetic engineering carried out without name or acknowledgement. Each entry in a plantation book, once thought anecdotal, now finds unsettling resonance in sequences of code extracted from living cells. For African American communities, these discoveries are more than scientific curiosities. They are legacies. Every DNA test, every ancestry report that reveals broken lines or clustered traits carries the shadow of forced reproduction. What appears as statistical anomaly to a scientist is, to descendants, a reminder of coercion that shaped their very being. Medical researchers, too, confront the uncomfortable inheritance of this history. Some genetic data used in modern studies originates from records or samples first gathered during slavery or in its aftermath, when black bodies were still used as unconsenting sources of study. The continuity raises ethical questions. How much of modern science stands upon foundations built through exploitation? And what responsibilities exist to acknowledge that lineage? The field of genetics prides itself on uncovering truth, but here the truth is double-edged. Every discovery of a hereditary marker carries with it an echo of the plantation. Every anomaly in population data, a reminder of forced intimacy and erased choice. The science is clinical, but the history it uncovers is visceral. DNA is often described as a code, a script of life. In this case, it reads also as a ledger, a living record that confirms the calculations once written in ink and stored in sealed chests. What the plantations began, genetics now verifies. The body remembers, even when the archives burn. The plantation experiment persists, not in ledgers alone, but in blood and bone, proof that history is never entirely past. The plantation is gone, its fields reclaimed by forest, its houses reduced to brick foundations hidden beneath vines. Yet on the same ground where enslaved men and women were once forced into calculated unions, a modern genetics facility now stands. Its glass windows and sterile halls mark a place devoted to the pursuit of science. But beneath its foundations lies a history the laboratory cannot escape. In recent years, researchers testing local soil samples for environmental studies uncovered something unexpected. Trace fragments of human DNA persisted in the earth, molecules preserved in clay, resistant to time. The sequences were partial, degraded, but distinct enough to suggest origins from centuries past. These genetic traces did not float freely. They clustered, forming recognizable markers consistent with the very traits once noted in plantation ledgers. The parallels unsettled the research team. Where the old records described strength, fertility, or hereditary weakness, the soil yielded patterns echoing those same qualities. It was as though the earth itself had become an archive, holding the remnants of lives once forced into experiment. Each handful of soil carried silent testimony, fragments of a population engineered without consent, their presence enduring far longer than the plantation itself. Inside the facility, scientists continue to map anomalous genetic patterns in local communities. Some appear ordinary enough, slight deviations, statistical curiosities. Yet when placed beside the plantation ledgers, the similarities grow difficult to dismiss. Families who live near the site today bear markers that mirror those described by plantation doctors a century and a half ago. Bloodlines shaped by coercion still ripple through the present. The symbolism is impossible to ignore. A genetics laboratory now occupies the same ground where the first American experiments in human heredity were conducted. The plantation's breeding farm, designed to manipulate bloodlines, has given way to a modern institute devoted to sequencing them. What once was performed with ledgers and overseers is now pursued with algorithms and sequencers. The continuity is haunting. Yet the tone of the facility's reports mirrors the language of the past: neutral, detached, clinical. Anomalous patterns, hereditary clusters. The phrasing is scientific, but the echoes are unmistakable. The plantation's logic, stripped of its overt brutality, survives in scientific vocabulary. The soil beneath the building is more honest than the reports inside it. It remembers, it retains, it testifies. The persistence of DNA in the ground is more than a biological curiosity. It is evidence that history cannot be erased by fire, silence, or the passage of time. The bodies once buried, broken, or scattered across these fields left traces that the earth itself refused to forget. Now, in the shadow of a gleaming laboratory, those traces speak again. The plantation may no longer stand, but the science it birthed has returned, drawn back to the very soil where it began. Past and present are fused here, in glass walls rising from ground still seeded with memory. The question is not whether the lab will uncover the truth. It is whether it will acknowledge what that truth really means. Not every record was burned. Not every ledger was lost to fire or rot. Some were gathered, bound, and quietly transferred into the hands of universities and research institutions. Today, in climate-controlled rooms, behind locked steel doors, lie files stamped with a word that feels out of place on history: classified. The vaults are not open to the public. Their catalogues exist only in fragments, titles without content, dates without description. Yet those who have glimpsed their covers speak of plantation records, medical journals, and family charts too explicit to dismiss, too damning to display. Within these sealed volumes are said to be the complete registers of breeding farms, the full genealogies of enslaved families, and correspondence between plantation doctors and early eugenicists. Why are they locked away? The official explanation is preservation, protection from decay. But the secrecy suggests another motive: the recognition that what lies inside these files could shift how we understand both science and slavery. To expose them would be to admit that the roots of modern genetics, of certain medical practices, are entangled with forced breeding and coerced bodies. The silence of the vaults protects not just paper, but reputation. The knowledge withheld is as heavy as the iron doors that guard it. We are left with fragments, hints of continuity, shadows of experiments that may not have truly ended. Some files bear dates from as recently as the mid-20th century, long after slavery's abolition, suggesting that the logic of hereditary control persisted, rebranded, and quietly pursued in new settings. If those records confirm such suspicion, their implications are vast. The atmosphere inside these vaults is one of suspended revelation. Each sealed box is both archive and accusation, a reminder of what has been concealed. We cannot read the words, but their very inaccessibility speaks. To lock away evidence is to acknowledge its weight, to admit, without admitting, that history still has teeth. Universities and medical institutions remain custodians of this silence. Their refusal to open the vaults transforms them into modern plantations of memory, controlling what may and may not be seen, what histories are allowed to speak, and what remains buried. The cycle of suppression continues, not with fire this time, but with classification. So the story closes, not with resolution, but with uncertainty. We know enough to trace the outline of what was done, but not enough to see the full scope. Some truths remain trapped in boxes, waiting in the dark, their secrets written in ink that has not yet been allowed to meet the light. Should these vaults ever be opened, and what might still be waiting inside? If such files surfaced tomorrow, would they bring closure, or would they fracture the narratives we have built about science, medicine, and history itself? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The plantation experiment may have ended in law, but in archive and blood it continues. And somewhere, in a locked room labeled classified, the final ledger still waits,